Good morning. I'm David Nash. This is the monthly meeting of the Homeless Initiative Advisory Committee. The HIAC serves as the governance board for the Asheville-Buckham Continuum of Care, which guides the local community in effectively responding to homelessness as a unified system. The HIAC is responsible for creating, implementing, and evaluating policies and strategies and steering resource allocation to most effectively end homelessness in Asheville and Buckham County. We'll start off with a roll call. I'm here. Lance Crawford.
Here.
David Bartholomew.
Here.
Jamie Benshoff.
Here.
Sarah Copley.
Here.
Elvia Diaz. Rick Freeman.
Here.
Claire Hubbard. Tricia Killian.
Here.
Marcus Laws.
Here.
Dustin Mailman. Tim McEllier. Celeste Ordaway.
Here.
Joelle Steininger. Jennifer Teague.
Here.
And Councilwoman Roney is not here, but probably will be shortly.
She emailed us that she's in traffic, but on her way.
Great. All right. We agreed to look at least one of our core principles each month, and the one that comes up today is creating accountable and transparent governance structures. The COC will advance a vision for a COC governance structure that is clear, efficient, and set up to effectively and accountably drive the community's work to end homelessness. Would anybody from the governance committee like to speak to that, or anybody have any thoughts on that goal at this point?
I just believe the governance committee or group is working to align the work and the efforts that are, and conversations that are happening in that group with this value listed here.
Great. Any other comments? Awesome. Oh, I forgot the minutes. Thank you for the reminder. We've received the April 13th minutes. I was not here for that meeting, but if there are no questions, can I have a motion to approve?
I'll motion to approve.
A second?
I'll second.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we have a presenter here today from the fire department to talk about the new emergency operations and continuity of operations planning process. Welcome, Chief Knight.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for allowing me to be here and share a little bit with you. My name is Jeremy Knighton. I'm the Division Chief of Emergency Management for the Asheville Fire Department. The reason I'm here is we are in the midst of rewriting two critical plans that exist within our city. And these plans are going to kind of give us a path forward here for the next few years as we look to continue to update and expand and look through ways that we can respond to, mitigate, but more importantly, prevent impacts to our community. Next slide, please. Next slide. So these two plans exist. The one on the left is the Emergency Operations Plan. And this plan is how the city will prepare for and respond to, as well as recover from, an impact to our community, whether that be natural disaster, man-made, or other. Many times, and we acknowledge that disasters, large incidents, emergencies impact folks in different ways. And the idea is for us to synergize our efforts, and this has not been just Jeremy from the fire department. This has been an entire city staff that has dedicated many, many hours from the very beginning through the process where we are today. We've been gathering once a week for every month since for about 6 months now, working through this as a staff to really all come together in a data-driven, objective-driven, making sure that we can take what lessons that we've learned and also operationalize them for the future. So the emergency operations plan, again, that's how we respond. And then the other half of the project is the continuity of operations plan. So the city is required, is honored to deliver core service. And those core services are very, very important. And it's especially important for us to prepare and understand what impacts look like to our city when obviously things are out of our control. And so how do we, as a city, on the left-hand side of the emergency operations, respond to, but also that how do we maintain that level of service as we go through these disasters and emergencies on the path forward. Both of these plans, these are both they're iterative processes. So this is not the first time that you're going to hear from me about this. And the goal is for me, next slide please, sorry, is what we want to understand and why I'm here and what's important. We want to understand the threats. We have a survey that's published. So there's a couple things. You're going to see a QR code here in a second, but I've also added this to Charles, and you'll be getting the flyer that we have so that you can take that out and disseminate that, because we want to hear from you. We want to understand better the threats, the hazards, the vulnerabilities of folks with lived experience. And there's lots of data sets that exist. When it comes to emergencies, we have vast resource libraries, but it's also very important that we acknowledge our community and what our community looks like, what they sound like, and how they want us to give feedback and what that feedback looks like. And so we want to know expectations, and then again, like I said, the prevention, the mitigation. How do we prepare our community to be more resilient? How do we bounce back quicker? And sometimes we have to acknowledge that it may be a new normal. As we traveled through the tragedy and the emergency that was COVID-19, we realized a lot of things that we took for granted. And the mechanisms of communication and how information was shared and how we organize ourselves, right? And all that is dependent, and we're going to be asking through the survey that I'll share in just a second, how can we help you? How can we meet our community members where they are? And whether that's events, is that preparedness, what does that look like, as well as what are your expectations of us as a city when it comes to emergency response? So the feedback, important to note that every piece of feedback, we have a group that's helping us collect, catalog, analyze this data. So the next time that I hear from you, or the next time you hear from me, I will be able to show you exactly how we use the feedback, how we use the different communication methods, and how we use the information in the survey to inform the plans and their context, but also the scenarios that we use in exercise. As we all know, a plan that's just simply a plan, it won't have a long shelf life unless we exercise, train, and operationalize it. And so the scenarios, what we hear from our community will help to inform that, and we will be able to not only talk about the exercises and the things we go through in training for and operationalizing these plans, but where the community wants to hear from us, what those prevention efforts need to look like, and where we meet them where they are as we move forward. And so you can kind of see our rhythm and the milestones that we're hitting here. And again, it's a circle for a reason. This is not a one-time through. This is going to be a continuation. We have to have the community input. All of these things are very, very important in order for us to have not just a plan, but a program. Next slide, please. Just to kind of give you some high-level examples of the questions that the survey will ask, which of the following have you personally experienced while living in Asheville? We want to know what you've experienced here to really level set the data that we're collecting, because that's going to look a little different too, right? We acknowledge that there are many folks that are new to our community in a relatively short time, and there are folks that have lived in our community for a long time. And so we want to have both inputs to see where what the actual issues and maybe what keeps you up at night are. So that's the kind of the questions. Next slide. And then again, the preparedness efforts, what does that look like? Again, there's data sets that say, hey, we want to hear from you here. As a fire department, we've had a lot of success in the school systems, but when we talk about all hazard response and education and preparedness, maybe that looks a little different. Maybe our community wants something a little more, maybe something a little more customized or a different way to share information. So we have that up there and just some examples of what that might look like. Next slide, please. And then here, again, just kind of finishing up, and I'll open it up for questions. Anytime I stand before a group, I want to make sure that I get AVL Alert up there. AVL Alert is the City of Asheville's communication and warning system. That's what we're going to hit you on the hip or on your phone when things are happening, and that's a tool that we use. And as many folks as we can get signed up for that, the more we are able to get our message out. And then the actual QR code on the right, my right, is the survey itself. So again, you can scan it here, but you will have the one-pager that talks about kind of a really high-level overview of what the scenario or what the survey is, and then a way to participate. And I will open it up for any questions. But before that, if there is an opportunity that I have or that you have to gather with folks in our community, a meeting, and you would like me to come speak and maybe have a deeper conversation about this, or where we have more time to really dig deep, I'm available. And so you'll have my contact information. You can get that through Emily, but I would love to come speak at any of your events. And again, we're looking for a very diverse group. We want to make sure all of our community is represented in this, and we want to make sure we get the information in front of everyone in our community. So with that, I will open it up for any questions that you might have. Yes, ma'am.
I missed who you're with.
Jeremy Knighton, Asheville Fire Department. I'm the Division Chief of Emergency Management.
And you're working within a group to identify what issues you can respond to?
Yeah, so I do emergency management, which is typically it's an all hazards approach. So what we are specifically working on are these large events. So tropical storms, floods, natural disasters, maybe man-made, and we're looking to get input and feedback on a survey that we're producing that talks about that, an experience that talks about that from our community.
This is not a large event, but has there been any conversation around seeing homeless people on the streets of downtown who are clearly decompensating, and many people want to know who they can call to get this person help?
Right. Yeah, so this is definitely, there will probably be feedback that talks to that, but this specifically doesn't have, that's I think, more along the lines of the community responder and the community paramedic folks. As far as who they can call, that would be that. But this is more along the lines of, that lived experience of mainly through natural disasters, and we're trying to capture, we made a lot of progress through COVID-19, but we also learned a lot. And so this is kind of out to capture the really high-level, large-scale emergencies and how we respond.
And Jamie, if I may, I would just say to your point, I just want to mention that there is adult protective services available. So if people have concerns about individuals that they deem to be functionally disabled or have some disabling condition and they are unable to meet their basic care needs and they're at risk for safety, we always encourage people to make a report to Adult Protective Services 250-5800. That's another option for people to be able to try to seek services and supports for clients.
All right, thank you. Can you repeat that phone number?
Yeah, it's 250-5800, and that'll send you to the Adult Protective Services intake line.
Thank you.
I have a question about the water emergency that we had earlier this year, maybe late last year. And I don't know the answer to this, but were any people experiencing homelessness impacted significantly by that emergency that we know of?
I'll say perhaps in an uninformed way, you might want to add to this, but we don't have a lot of service providers in the geographic area that was most impacted by the water outage, so not to my knowledge, but you may have more information.
Yeah, the water outage did not affect everyone uniformly
Right.
as far as the geography. So there were many places that had water, many of the downtown corridor and other parts of West Asheville. It was very not uniform, I guess is the best way to put it. So it was very hard to know that, to understand that, but we were able to pivot very quickly and deliver water as one of the operational tasks and very related to this. So we were able to reach a lot of folks with the water delivery and through our partners with 211. So with that in mind, if there were impacts, we were able to respond to that.
Sure. And I'm just highlighting it as another type of potential emergency that we need to be prepared for, particularly for people experiencing homelessness.
Absolutely.
Also, as far as the folks who are decompensating downtown, I know that the fire department and county emergency management and law enforcement have a pilot going on right now downtown to engage with folks, and maybe we can get a report on that at a future meeting.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Chief. All right, work group progress reports, starting with coordinated entry.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Looking at the meetings that we've been going through up until yesterday, we saw some accomplishments in looking for community feedback regarding a previous assessment that had been done by a work group on last year. Also looking at work group strategies to increase productivity. We saw challenges as individual and agency participation due to time constraints, as well as review and adoption of a vulnerability assessment. Needs that were indicated were identification of referral points, a connection with the outreach teams to review coordinate assessments and referrals. As we met yesterday, we came to the conclusion that we needed to take a little bit of a step back and really identify what the work group's charges were and make sure that we were in line with those charges. So our focus has shifted away from running towards implementing an assessment or producing an assessment to really focusing on the 4 core elements of coordinated entry: access, assessment, prioritization, and referral in succession, and looking at where we are as a community right now, where we would like to go, and what our current capabilities are with the resources that we have. So over our future meetings, we'll be looking at our policy and procedures related to each core element of coordinated entry. We'll be identifying and revising prioritization characteristics, updating our action plan as we go. And once we have our policies and procedures set, we will then look at our community assessment to make sure that it is in alignment with those core elements and it does provide us with an opportunity to move forward. And then we'll be able to change in real time if there are circumstances that require us to do so.
Questions for Marcus? I have a question that may not specifically relate to the planning for improvements of coordinated entry, but I just want to hear for sure if we have used our coordinated entry process effectively to line people up for the Compass Point Village coming online in the next couple of months. Has that all been through, has that all been through coordinated entry?
Yes, it has.
And and have we evaluated that to make sure that we are being equitable from a race and gender identity perspective?
We are, and we're doing that on a continuous basis. So we've already slated all 60 folks that will be moving towards Compass Village. And as we continue to build week by week, we're continuing to reassess whether or not those folks are eligible, whether or not we're meeting those metrics for race equity, and then making sure that we're communicating with the city if there are any issues, and if they are spotting any issues on their end, they're communicating back with us so that we are being most efficient.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Governance?
The governance work group accomplished a big task by identifying standing meeting times. So we are now scheduled to meet on the first and third Monday from 10 to 12. It is a hybrid meeting, so it's physically here in the space on the 5th floor, or a virtual option is available. We have been reviewing other charters from other communities, and we've been discussing standing committees, membership, appointments, and board structure. We did set a goal to have a draft charter to the HIAC committee by the July meeting. So hopefully we'll have something to you all to review by that meeting in July. The challenges, there are numerous options available to you. There are over 400 different COC structures across the country, different perspectives. Everybody who comes to the meeting brings a different thought process on how we should organize the governance structure, and then really trying to find the right fit that fits the Asheville-Buncombe community. We are continuing to gather information, and our next steps is there's actually a meeting tomorrow. It's a virtual meeting in which one of our work group members will be meeting with San Diego, and a couple other individuals are going to join that call to learn a little bit more about some of the challenges they face, their structure, and some recommendations that they may have as we build our structure. And our focus is just to continue to work through the content and adding to the charter. Any questions?
I read the recent HUD review, and I was wondering how you are addressing, we got hit on some scores.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for bringing that up. I'll be honest, we haven't discussed it yet, but we meet on Monday, and we will definitely look at that and take that back to the group for discussion.
Thank you.
And I'll have an update for you at the next meeting about that.
I have a question. Are we in when we first started this process, we talked about the idea potentially of folding the Homeless Coalition into the COC structure as a formal part of the membership of the overall COC organization, with representation obviously on the governing board. Is that something that the committee has taken up yet?
We have definitely discussed that. So, and Emily's probably better to give this update, but my understanding of the COC structure is that you have a governing board and then you have a general membership. And so making sure that the Homelessness Coalition is included in both our governance structure and in that general membership is going to be important. And so that's really where the committee or the work group has spent a lot of time in talking about, is like who makes up that governing structure and how are those individuals appointed, elected, identified, et cetera.
I'll add to that Carrie Thomason is part of the governance work group, and she's also one of the Homeless Coalition leaders. So we have that representation in that work group.
And I don't know if the discussion has filtered back to the Homelessness Coalition, but if anybody is here from that organization, then it should be. Hopefully it's something that's going on as a discussion in the community and not just in the work group. Thank you. Any other questions? Outreach and encampment.
So we've did change our meeting times, and what we decided to do was to try to meet in person to sort of improve the conversation and the quality of the dialogue and make sure it was more accessible to everyone. I think it was some of the conversations we're having, very difficult to make outreach and encampment policies and come to decisions about that. So we had our first in-person meeting this week on Monday, and we're going to also shift to every other week, so there's time to meet and do some work in between the meetings. We were finding that by the time we had the meeting and tried to do some drafting and send it out to the group, it was already Friday, and there just wasn't enough time to work with city staff and worker in smaller groups. So we changed, we're meeting for 2 hours every other week, so it's the same amount of time, but it's Mondays, every other Monday from 3 to 5. And last time we were at Haywood Street. We did not have a hybrid option this time, but we intend to have a hybrid option for those who can't make it going forward. This week, I think it was a really good meeting. We really started with, since we were meeting in person for the first time, and I think we kind of hit some roadblocks, we kind of restarted the conversation with a vision exercise. It's called a victory exercise, where everyone sort of envisions what happens after an encampment policy is agreed upon by the community, and then work backwards to see, what the strengths and weaknesses of our group and community are and how we're going to get there. So some of you have maybe participated in some of those kinds of exercises, and I think it went really well, and we have a meeting with Elvia and Mary and hopefully Claire on Monday of next week to look at the work plan that we've already approved and see how it might need to be adjusted, considering our new meeting schedule. We're still hopeful that we can stick to some of the work plan, but we're going to divide up into groups to start taking on the drafting of certain sections, I think, on Monday, and then we'll have the full work group back the following Monday. Any questions?
Did you say a target date for the?
Well, so in our original work plan, we had hoped to get something to this committee by June, but we are going to re-look at the work plan. I'm not sure that's going to be possible, and it may be that we want to come after the governance anyway, but we will get back to you next meeting if that date's changed, but I don't think we're going to make June, to be honest.
I think it's important to set a goal, even if you need to adjust it, so that, just to stay focused on it. So I would encourage that. Maybe you can set that between now and the next meeting and let us know what it is.
Yeah, we need to have a work plan to keep us focused, because the discussions can go in so many directions. So we have one. It's just we're already realizing that we're not going to make those deadlines. So like I said, Monday we'll meet to have a new one, and we will have a target date.
David, one question. It came up in the coordinated entry group on yesterday, and I suspect it probably came up in the outreach group about the relationship between outreach and coordinated entry. Maybe it's further down the timeline, but I'm just wondering how the conversation around that went.
Absolutely, yeah, it has come up. I think almost every meeting we end up talking about some work that the other group is doing, right? Because there's a lot of overlap in what we're all trying to do here. So I do think that will happen. I think we'll need to meet, and maybe it can start with you and I talking and bringing some of the group together just to make sure we're all on the same page. Because there is, there are going to be some direct overlap in that our policy is going to be your policy. Right. And that's part of what we'll be discussing on Monday too, is when we need to have conversations with other stakeholders, other working groups, because we hope to use our work group to get something to discuss with other stakeholders, and so I'm sure we will.
All right, cool, thank you.
I just have a comment. The encampments are a very polarizing, sensitive issue, so I appreciate that you're taking your time to come to, like you called it, a victory exercise vision.
Thank you, David. Shelter. Somebody running the show here. So the shelter work group has completed our tours of the main local shelter providers. We saw a lot of good work going on, and we saw a lot of empty beds. So that's somewhat informing our process going forward. We have sent out a request for information to see if any of the current providers are interested in providing shelter along their lines as recommended by the National Alliance to End Homelessness in their definition of effective shelter. And I'll talk through that in just a minute. We drafted an RFP for your review today, and not necessarily approval in a rigid form, but approval for us to move forward with a process that may include some amendments if we get questions back from providers. And we are beginning to develop plans for a longer-term approach that may involve construction of new facilities. This is something that's under consideration by leadership at both the city and county levels, and something that we definitely want to be able to guide in our role as the governing board. Challenges are remembering the goals and not getting distracted by things that we think can be, or the low-hanging fruit, taking advantage of the low-hanging fruit, but remembering not to be satisfied with half measures. Needs, and this is going to echo what some of the other work group chairs have said. We need to meet with outreach and coordinated entry to discuss how these new shelter beds and/or a new facility will be part of the system that we're implementing, so we don't continue the disjointed system that we have now with some level of coordinated entry at AHOPE, and then shelters that have their own entry systems, and outreach that may or may not have a place to take somebody when they decide to come inside, based on current restrictions or based on that person's preferences, or based on the fact even that they have a pet. How are we going to do that? And I think one thing for the governance committee work group to think about is these work groups were organized around specific goals to try to accomplish that, but in the governance structure, we may need something like a flow committee that focuses on people going through the system and making the system easier and more flexible for people to navigate. We are planning to issue an RFP soon, probably within the next week, if you all approve the concept today, for the immediate expansion of beds. We have some recommendations from NAEH around from other shelters that they have identified as highly effective shelters, and we want to reach out to those, particularly as we start thinking about the potential to build a new facility or develop it in some way, and then that ongoing planning. And that's it for our report. I can flow on into the RFP unless there's questions about the report. So the RFP, did everybody get a chance to read it? Take time to go through it. I will just highlight a few sections then. There's an introductory section saying how we got to where we are today. The number of beds that we're asking for is coming directly from the recommendations of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. 60 beds for non-veteran single adults of any gender or gender identity. 25 enhanced beds for folks with more critical needs, and 10 beds for families. Those are the 95 beds that NAEH recommended to increase our current capacity by 30%. And so we're putting this out to the community, specifically to existing shelter providers and other groups that may not have an open shelter right now, but have provided winter shelter or Code Purple services in the past. We are looking broadly in the community for creative approaches to how we would fund and structure these beds. These goals, let me read from the NAEH report, and the goals are all derived from that. Effective shelters embrace a housing-first approach, implement safe and appropriate diversion, offer immediate and low-barrier access to anyone facing a housing crisis, measure shelter performance in order to improve results, and practice cultural humility and inclusion. Sorry, my reading skills are limited today for some reason. And follow HUD's equal access rule, which relates to sexual orientation and gender identity. So I won't go through each of these. You all have read them, and we'll give feedback if you have any, but all of these came from that paragraph. And we did ask NAEH to help us flesh out those terms for this RFP. We also want to ensure that any organizations that respond to this will be active participants in the continuum of care, participate in coordinated entry, participate in HMIS, and send a representative to the COC for active coordination. In the proposals, we're asking them to identify the number and type of new shelter beds based on the types listed in the RFP, what they particularly would like to focus on, and it can be a combination. Where that shelter would be located, an anticipated start date, and we're asking for that to be no later than October 1 of this year. We were asking for the provider experience and qualifications, and we may juggle this number 5 a little bit after our discussion earlier this week. We want to know what their staffing structure and on-site services, either on-site services through their agency or in partnership with another agency. And we want to know very specifically how they plan to meet the effective shelter requirements in the other one. So I think we're going to break number C out into its own category and put a lot of weight on that process. Any limitations that they see based on their facilities or the populations they would be willing to serve, and a 12-month budget, description of other needs that they may have. This date is not firm yet, but we would like to have proposals that we can evaluate and start talking with the city and county about by mid-June. Any other questions? Any questions, comments, amendments?
I have a question. Just to be clear on the cost that can be included in the budget for shelters who are interested in applying, if they don't currently participate in HMIS, can there be a line item to include their transition to it?
Sure. Do we talk a minute about how we handle HMIS fees right now?
So I think there are two things related to that. One is the actual license fee, which the city pays for through our contract with MICA, Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness, who manages our vendor relationship for HMIS. We fund that contract with the Continuum of Care HMIS grant that is part of our batch Continuum of Care funding. So that's to say there's no cost to any agency to participate in HMIS in terms of access to the system. The other piece is staff capacity to do that data entry. And I would say that that's certainly, it's certainly possible to include that in the operational plan. That is a reality in operating a shelter.
Great, thanks.
I have a question. So one of the things that stood out to me in the shelter work group was when you toured, you saw so many open beds, right? And at the same time, that's juxtaposed with the recommendations to increase our shelter beds. So is the vision with this RFA to ensure that these beds will stay full by the requirements, which are more person-centered and lower barrier?
Yes.
Okay.
And you know, the pit count presentation that's going to be here in a few minutes talks a little bit about why people are living outside and the barriers that they see coming in at this point.
So the RFA is tailored to ensure that we're addressing those barriers.
We
with
want this to be
proposal.
as low barrier as possible. We want the screening criteria to be designed to screen people in who have difficult challenges rather than screening them out.
Also, if I can add to that, I think some of those empty beds we saw are empty because of lack of capacity or lack of resources. And so there's some physical inventory that can be activated with some programming and additional resources. So this is partly an opportunity to create a pathway for that.
Staffing capacity in particular?
So I'd like, I'd like to add to that as well. I don't feel like we have a good handle on the non-congregate needs of the community. If you look at the pit count, non-congregate beds are like at a 3 or 5 year low. And if you look at last year's pit count information when people were interviewed about why they wouldn't go into shelters, it's a general term of I don't feel safe or there are too many rules. I feel like we're doing a great job knocking the rules down, but don't feel safe is very difficult to outline. And I know in this week's discussion in the shelter group, the whole non-congregate thing was brought up, which if you look carefully at the RFP in its current state, doesn't actually encourage people to bring together non-congregate. So I think that's part of the reason why the group wants to keep on turning the crank on that to try to figure out how to find that balance. Because I have the same concern that even if staffed properly, will our unhoused population fit the criteria that those providers are willing to offer? And will they feel safe, or will we find that we've created a bunch of beds that aren't used?
Go ahead.
I'd like to speak to that. I was in Rescue Mission and also Steadfast House, which is what Transformation Village is now. And it isn't a question of physical safety. It is living in congregate living with people you don't know and you wouldn't necessarily choose to associate with. It is emotional safety. And many of the shelter providers are recognizing that and including peer support as part of their staff. And that is something that will ameliorate that lack of safety we're seeing in the pit count.
And I'll respond also that you're right, we didn't specifically address the non-congregate, and that's something we'd like to amend going forward, probably next Monday at the work group session. The study said that we should ensure that interim housing sites are not all located in one part of the city, and also, I can't find the language, identify non-congregate sites that would significantly improve the number of people accepting shelter placement. So that is a good catch, and we'll make sure to include that in the RFP. Jim, go, sorry. She pulled her mic down.
That's fine. That's fine. We'll both grab him for a minute.
Sorry, Tim.
That's all right.
So I have a few different things, and some of it is about wording. I spend a lot of time in words and policies, and so there's a word around the very beginning where you start to talk about, or where it starts to talk about the requirements. Let's see. And the word safely is used, and I'm just wondering about if there's an ability to define that a slight bit more. So under 60 beds for non-veterans, beds should be accessible to anyone in need who can participate safely. I think that could leave a lot of vagueness for a provider to screen out individuals. I know it's kind of listed further down, so there may be something to kind of highlight there. There's also a little further down the concept under requirements, new shelter beds should meet. I think that should actually say must meet or expectation to meet. To leave should allows, again, the vagueness of being able to do it or not do it. My only other two comments would be in regards, so I agree with some of the conversation that we've just had about the current bed count and then the additional of these beds. So just wanting to somehow ensure that this is an expansion and not a revision of beds. And maybe that is gonna be what happens, but I think we just need some clarity on that, if that's what any of these providers are looking at doing. Are they gonna take current existing beds and transition those, and just having that part be really clear in their proposal? And then lastly, I wonder if there's not a way to revise that number 6 under the proposal of description of any limitations to meeting practices. I feel like if we've outlined requirements, to then allow an opportunity to say, oh, but we're not gonna serve certain clients, continues to maybe cycle back to the situation we have now. So I would just wonder if that's something that the committee or work group might wanna review.
Yes. Thank you, Jen, for those. And I don't, there's some work group members here. Are we fine with that? I mean, we'll take those back and try to incorporate them.
Yeah, so David, I just wanted to point out too, when we were talking about empty beds, that, a number of the places that, we toured are program beds. And there's a difference between, and I guess this is just my, personal soapbox, but I just want to make sure everybody understands. There's a difference between a program bed and a shelter bed, because when you come into a program, you're making commitments to the program and certain aspects of the program, like sobriety and, things of that nature, okay? So if you're not making those commitments, or you're not willing to, then you're not going into, a program. So there's a difference here in what we're talking about. And Jen, to go back to what you said with existing providers, my opinion is, I think with some of the existing providers, it's going to come down to reallocating some of those beds to a shelter operation versus a program operation, and even expansion, because you may have some providers that want to expand and pick up this piece that maybe they normally don't do, or they do on a small scale, or something like that. So I just want to, point that out when we're having this conversation, so we're comparing apples to apples.
So I'd like to sort of amplify what Tim just said. And there was one line in David's slide that said kind of what the plan was. We've been given this list of shelters that are in other cities that are consistent with NAEH's belief of what we need. Hopefully they won't be program shelters. But those kinds of questions should be, we should create a sort of checklist of questions that we want to ask these providers, and then build sort of a matrix of what works for them, what doesn't work for them, so that we can avoid the pitfalls that they've climbed over, right? Because they've undoubtedly climbed over some pitfalls from their original charter to how it turned out. And that's a lot of work. I'm glad you have eager deadlines, but I know how hard it is to reach out to people like that and get a full set of questionnaires, so I think we may need help.
And I think those questions, we can certainly try to expedite that outreach process, but I think those questions will probably go more to inform the new shelter option than the short-term, the long-term option rather than the short-term. And I think, Tim's point is valid. What we saw were empty beds. And we want to make sure that all of our current providers have an opportunity to help us fill this gap if they choose to do so, rather than immediately go and invest in a multi-million-dollar construction of a new facility or rehab of an existing facility. So that's the purpose. One purpose is to get some immediate needs met between now and winter. And the other is to see what our current providers are willing and able to put forward to use those empty beds.
One additional comment to Jen's comment about the requirements in number 6 in particular. That might be a good question to leave in to kind of identify any sticky points that we might get into, and better to know on the front end, and that could be a part of the screening process to see hesitation and where that may lie, and how we could potentially overcome that.
That's a really good point. If they have limitations, we need to know them. And that could be, you know, we can't take sex offenders because of the location of our facility or something like that. So, you know, we need to, we do need to know those things.
May I ask a couple questions?
Councilwoman?
Thank you for asking the questions about the definition between and explaining the program beds versus the shelter beds. Is there a part of this RFP that might address if beds are transitioned so that we can expand capacity with partners, that there's an assurance that they won't switch back, or what happens if they are retransitioned back to program beds from shelter beds? Is that conversation happening with the work?
I would think that, so if we're going into RFP process, there'll be a contract signed. So if, you know, and I think that, you know, however that's drawn up, we need to put those caveats in there. So, you know, if somebody does decide to switch over, you know, they're not in breach. So, you know, if they do that, there should be a certain notification process, you know, from both sides. You know, I think that would be an appropriate way to handle it. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think that, you know, those kind of things would need to be contained in, you know, whatever we present to a provider and enter an agreement with them.
Is the shelter group considering that already, or would that come later in the contract process?
Well, I think in the RFP, we're making it clear that these are the beds we want, and these are the beds, depending on the quality of your proposal and what we've seen you do in the past, you know, these are the beds that we intend to recommend to the city and county to fund. And so I think it'll be clear. I think when it gets to the contracting process with one of the governmental entities that's going to provide the funding, you know, I think that's when we make clear that these are the beds you've agreed to provide, this is the type of service you've agreed to provide, we expect you to continue to do that as long as this contract is in place.
And I imagine participation in HMIS may help to initiate a conversation if we weren't aware that the transition was happening. The second one is, the question I had is there a conversation about projected population growth, both locally and in North Carolina? Is there a conversation happening about how we're going to find ourselves in the same position if we only project for the problem of today?
There is a conversation, I don't know that we've gone into great detail, but I think in the report that we got from NAEH, it made clear that we need to continually evaluate the need and be flexible in terms of what we can offer in the future. So it won't be a one-shot deal, you know, and I don't know how we actually can predict population growth exactly. I, like you, think that with climate change and other factors in the world today, we are going to see nationwide an increase in the number of people experiencing homelessness over time. So that's something we do need to think long-term at. And I think building that flexibility in to be able to continually reassess what we need and adjust is important.
I would give a metric, something that could be easily pulled, like the North Carolina Department of Transportation projects 12% population growth in North Carolina. So just basic, like, even if one were to consider, like, should we look at a 12% population growth across all different housing needs, and housing insecurity being one of them?
But I also think too, in looking at that, and I think that's a great point, Kim, you know, looking at projected growth as we move forward, so we'll know how to operate. But I think that projected growth needs to be, you know, spread across the community and the community providers and stuff. And this is conversation that we've had in the shelter work groups. The providers have to be active in working with that shelter so the shelter's not overrun. You just don't want people coming in there, you know, and staying there, and then all the burden be on that shelter. We have to work to move those people out into those program beds that we talked about, you know, earlier, or into permanent housing or, transitional housing or whatever the case may be. But we need to use, my opinion, that particular shelter as like an intake hub and hold people there. Because I think one of the issues in folks moving into programs and, things like that is, they don't understand the programs. They don't want to make a commitment to the programs, and part of that's because they don't understand the program and that sort of thing. So, and again, this all ties together, like, y'all were saying earlier, with the encampment piece and the shelter piece and whatever. If you go out to an encampment, to work with somebody or move them out or whatever, you can't expect them to make a decision about what I'm going to do right here, this minute, that's going to impact, me for the next 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So we need to better work with those folks and let them understand and help them to understand what's available to them and, that sort of thing, and help them to grow into it. You can't expect people to make those kind of decisions when they're cold and hungry and, haven't had a shower or proper rest or anything like that, because once you get those things, and, we see that all the time, with the folks that we deal with, decisions can change based on the environment and, how you feel health-wise and energy-wise and, things of that nature. So if we get people in and we go through that process and get them fed and get them showers and proper rest, proper nutrition, whatever, and then they start making decisions, hey, then, we got something we can work with. So it's a process that we're going to have to go through, and it's a lot of people being involved, some through this RFP and that sort of thing, but others in just the natural course of, doing their job and serving the community through the other providers.
Can you speak to the emergency room concept, Emily, or did you have another thought?
Another thought?
Okay.
I think some of what you're lifting up is really the work of the continuum of care as a whole, not specific to shelter, but to all interventions. And that, as the board, as the governance work group does its work, and as the board transitions, and as we build out structure to look at inflow or flow, as you talked about earlier, and system performance, I think there will be many opportunities to be sure that we have really strong data so that we can do meaningful projections, and that we are able to look at how do we right-size all of our interventions, including shelter capacity, but also prevention capacity, diversion capacity, exits to permanent housing. How do we build the pipeline that we need based on the data that we have? So I think it's excellent to raise that question when we're looking at developing new shelter capacity, and I also think it's broader and is really the maybe the primary work of the continuum of care.
And thank you for saying continuum of care, because that's the word I left out. So everything that I said and everything that she said, that's our continuum of care. And that's the whole community. That's the whole community, all of our providers. We all have to work together to make this thing work and, get people, into homes of their own, which is what we all want, so.
I certainly appreciate adding to my understanding. Thank you. What I hear is that both things are true, and I've thought this as the National Alliance to Homelessness came and presented their report, is both, we want to have an emergency facility not unlike an emergency room, but not keep people in the emergency room, right?
Right.
And also, if we don't build facilities for what we know is future capacity, and the National Alliance to Homelessness said we had an opportunity to meet the needs of 50%, who are the 50% of the people that we're planning to leave behind? So I don't want us to miss an opportunity, so thank you for entertaining my questions.
Thank you.
One additional question, and I apologize if I'm just not seeing it in here. Is this proposal meant to be a shelter where people are not shuffled in and out every day, where someone can stay, receive services and supports until they are able to move into permanent supportive housing or another program?
Observation. I think a lot of what we see in terms of unsheltered homelessness in downtown Asheville in particular is the fact that people are housed overnight, they're released in the morning, they need to go to A-Hope during the day and stand in line outside to get in the door. And then they need to go to Haywood Street sometimes to get lunch. And, you know, some of them make their living off of panhandling in downtown Asheville. So we do need a facility where people are able to come, get services, stay during the day, and rapidly, or in a reasonable time, flow into another intervention with a focus on permanent housing as the real ultimate solution for them.
So that'll be a requirement of the shelter.
I think, in my mind, it will be. Yeah,
Okay.
we can. Any other questions? We're running a little behind time. If not, I would entertain a motion to allow the work group to make these revisions to the RFP and issue it soon.
I'll motion.
I'll second.
Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you very much. Okay, we're at 10 o'clock and 15 minutes behind Emily, so roll. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for all of the inputs, very valuable. Appreciate it.
Great. I am, on the next agenda item, which is several pots of federal funding, I'm going to switch the order briefly and talk about the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program first, partly because we have Sarah Dickerson in the room who will need to leave in a minute in case there are any questions for her. So you all may, if you have been involved in this a while, you may recall this from a few years ago. HUD has issued a couple of rounds of Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, YHDP funding, that is specifically targeting youth homelessness, of course. In general, the process of this is similar to the annual continuum of care process that you're familiar with. You can see the eligible activities there, and then if you'll scroll down a bit. And then you can see the review criteria. So HUD has recently made this application opportunity available to COCs across the country. Applications are due June 27th. And we specifically included the review criteria here because from staff perspective and from some community conversation, there are some requirements in this particular application process and for this pot of funding that our COC doesn't yet have the infrastructure to support. So we don't currently have a youth action board established, for example, which is one of the requirements of this funding opportunity. We do have a youth work group that has been meeting since 2020, and that's been staff in our department have convened that, but that's been a relatively informal group of providers who are working with that population in our community, and you can see some of those listed there. Debbie on our team is working with that work group, and they reviewed this grant opportunity at their meeting on April 24th and identified that we don't currently have the infrastructure needed in order to pursue this opportunity. And Sarah may want to speak to that, or you all may have questions around that. But also identified that they would like to really work hard to put some of that in place so that we are prepared for these opportunities in the future as they arise. I think there is also room for the governance work group to consider some of the structural components of this again so that we're better prepared for future funding opportunities. With all those caveats, this is a board decision about whether you want to pursue this funding application. Again, you can see what the requirements are there, and one of the review criteria is around community need, and one of the things that work group has identified is just a lack of strong data. Our point-in-time count doesn't show a large youth subpopulation, and also, as with all of our work, we know that there are folks that are not reflected in those data that we have. So one of the things the youth work group wants to address is building out our data collection capacity. Can I ask you to chime in if you want to add anything?
Yeah, so with this, we definitely have had a group of people getting together we really want to focus on making our focus in that work group action-oriented moving forward. There's been a lot of like case review in years past, but being action-oriented, we want to really focus on doing what needs to be done so that in the future we can have elements in place so that if this funding wants to be pursued, we can have a strong application. Like Emily mentioned, data is a big part of that. We've recently added several organizations onto this work group and have now created a pretty wide range of providers that are working with youth at all aspects. So that's really all I have, but I'm open to any questions.
Hey, I would make a recommendation about the Youth Action Board. If you do decide to pursue that, you might, instead of just developing that for grant opportunities, it might be really valuable for the work group to have, you know, that information from youth that are being served.
Yeah, absolutely. Our hope is to be able to put together that youth action board and be able to compensate for lived experience in the future and have the youth be a very involved part of it. The application actually does have a question on it that specifically asks the Youth Action Board, what have you done to impact homelessness in your community in the last year? So making that a very robust Youth Action Board is really important for this application process and for the community and its services.
Jamie?
I thought that there was more information regarding those who are aging out of foster care and have a potential for youth homelessness. Is that not part of the case review?
So we do have data on youth who have been in the foster care system, but when youth have aged out, so statistically youth who age out of the foster care system are likely to experience that homelessness within the first year after aging out. Typically there is a gap there. So if they are not involved with some service in between, it's not always captured. If someone is exiting foster care without a housing plan, DSS might have information on that, but there can be a gap without contact. And young adults can be very difficult to stay in touch with. I've recently been using the term that they change their phone number as often as the rest of us change our underwear. So it can be really hard to stay in touch. We do have mental health providers involved in this group, as well as social services through DSS, and then nonprofit social services like ELIDA and services that are at like youth villages and things like that. So there are a lot of providers that are involved with this that are not necessarily addressing homelessness as their primary service, which means that most of those providers are not integrated into HMIS. And taking that data and managing to get the releases of information to cross-reference and making sure we're not duplicating data is part of the task that we need to take on.
Thank you.
Jen?
Can you define the age bracket of youth? Like, what is that?
Yes, HUD defines youth as someone who has not yet had their 25th birthday. So it can be a minor. Typically, HUD will say 16 to their 25th birthday, so 16 to 24. And typically, it'll use the term unaccompanied homeless youth. So those who are unaccompanied in our McKinney-Vento programs within our school system and who are still minors are a part of that as well.
So the recommendation, if I hear it correctly, is that we not apply this year, but is there a commitment to building the infrastructure for future potential applications?
That is the hope.
Is there a commitment to that, or do we feel?
We as service providers are absolutely committed to it, and our hope is that HIAC will also support that commitment and be a sounding board and a support as things come along. Things like reviewing best policy, having the potential of youth being represented on the governance committee of the COC, things like that. As we go through this next year and get into this RFP for the next year, we want to make sure we have all those pieces in place that people with decision-making power need to be able to support as well.
Do I, before you sit down, let's go ahead and vote on this, but if you can also give an update on the foster youth to independence before you sit down. So do we have a motion to I guess, do Do we need to vote no, or do we need to just see if there's a motion to move forward? Do I have a motion related to this recommendation?
I'll motion.
Second.
So the recommendation is not to apply this year, but to work with the youth-serving agencies to build the infrastructure and be ready the next time this comes out about a year from now. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
David, before we move, I just want to make a comment in reference to the question about governance structure. That is something that the governance committee has been talking about, is the youth homelessness. And also in some charters, it is earmarked about a standing work group or a committee. And so we'll take that back for discussion as well.
Thank you. So FYI, do you want to give the short of that, or?
Yes, just real quickly, last meeting we talked about the Foster Youth to Independence Tenant Protection Vouchers, FYI TPVs. The agencies that have been involved with that and the Housing Authority, we have gone through the process, signed the MOU. The MOU has been sent to HUD with all of our collected applications for our qualified youth that we have been able to verify. We are still hoping to be able to continue to verify others to send in additional requests. At this point, the ones that have been submitted will be reviewed by HUD, and we're waiting to hear back. And if we can get any others in, we will absolutely do so. We don't have guarantees on what HUD will or won't approve, and capacity continues to dwindle as they're awarding those to COCs. So at this time, there's no update on any receipts of any vouchers, but the application has been submitted.
It's a non-competitive application, and so all the infrastructure is in place as long as HUD says we've checked the boxes correctly. This is a non-competitive cycle, so we should be hearing soon, hopefully affirmatively. So far, of all the potential youth, we've identified 5 in the county who qualify and have agreed to sign the release of information, that sort of thing. So, Thank you. Any questions about that? All right. Back to you, Emily.
All right, 2 more fun bits of information about federal funding. The first, we talked about this briefly at the last meeting, but the day before our last meeting, we received our debrief from the most recent COC competition. This is all the feedback that we are going to get on the application that we submitted, and if you had a chance to review this, you can see that we do get a total picture of our score. We don't get more detail than we have here. So they have pulled out some particular sections and questions and given us detailed information about how we scored compared to the points that were available, but we don't have that for every question that's part of the application. So I'm going to talk through this. I would invite you to interrupt me at any moment if you have questions, and I will try to do this briefly, but also this is really important for us. This is the primary way that we increase federal funding in our community for homeless programs. The higher we score on this collaborative application, consolidated application, the more likely we are to get bonus projects awarded, and then bonus projects become renewal projects, and that is how we snowball our federal dollars for homeless and housing programs in our community. The content of this application is not only about how we will spend those dollars, but about our COC as a whole and how we're performing collectively in our work to end homelessness. So really is directly related to all of the work that you guys do on the board. So first,
Should we focus on everything or just go to the places where we?
opportunity areas.
Opportunities for growth.
So we did just fine on Housing First, did just fine on street outreach. You want to scroll down? Did well on rapid rehousing, increasing capacity for non-congregate sheltering. That's certainly something that has come out of the pandemic. It's not something that we had prior to COVID. Good on partnering with public health agencies, good on racial equity, good on involving folks with lived experience. and good on our process through the competition last year. So you'll recall that the finance work group of HIAC reviewed applications, used a scorecard, et cetera, brought those recommendations back to you all for approval. All of that was positively scored in our application. Opportunity area, as we know, to increase our bed coverage rate in HMIS. What HUD is looking for in this application is that you have at least 85% of beds of any type, so 85% of emergency shelter beds, 85% of permanent supportive housing beds, et cetera, are in HMIS, and we did not have that in multiple categories last year. I think that our score will be higher than that this year, but this, I know that we talk about this a lot. You all are committed to this. As staff, we're committed to this. Charles is doing a lot of work on this, so I think we'll have some opportunity to improve that in the upcoming competition. We did submit our LSA report on time. Where we really lost points is in our overall system performance, and again, we don't have full detail about exactly where those areas were. If you want to keep scrolling. Length of time homeless, we only scored 5 points out of a possible 13. So we have a lot of folks who are staying homeless for an extended period of time in our COC. 7 out of 13 points in exits to permanent housing destinations. And 2 out of 8 points in returns to homelessness. And then if you'll go on down. So this is the summary, and if you look at that, the lowest white line, 2C, system performance, includes those sections that we just breezed through. But Charles went through our system performance measures report at the last, I believe, HIAC meeting. And so we want to really stay grounded in what those metrics are and make sure that as we build our governance and as we do our work in the COC, we're really mindful of those opportunities to improve our system performance. I would say as a small, I can't quantify this, but a small portion of the scoring here is related to some data quality issues. And so as those improve, that will improve the score there. Charles is doing a lot of work on that, but overall, our primary opportunity is really to improve our system performance based on those metrics that Charles reviewed last month.
There's one that on this sheet that you didn't highlight, which is coordination with housing and healthcare. It looks like we have a lot of opportunity for growth as well. So, do you know more about that one, or is that?
Those were some targeted questions related to new housing projects that specifically integrate healthcare components. So certainly opportunity there. I don't believe that was an emphasis in the prior competition. I think that was new in the past year. Mm-hmm.
We do have 2 FQHCs, and maybe 3, but 2 in the county overall that, conversations could be had about that kind of development of permanent supportive housing in conjunction with healthcare on-site, potentially.
Kind of in the same spirit, if you look at 1C and 1D, we lost points for coordination and engagement, which is, again, is just the overall work of the COC and making sure that we're collaborating. Again, we don't have more detail than is shared here, so I don't know exactly what those points were, what our opportunities are. And then also project review. In the question that they highlighted, we did score well, but in the overall section, we have some points lost.
Any questions?
Emily, if I can make a suggestion, the next community provider meeting that we have, I think it'd really be beneficial to go over this with all the community providers, especially our areas of opportunity, because really that's where the rubber meets the road, and they could probably assist and help us get those scores up, exponentially.
Great. I think what we will want when the next continuum of care competition comes, when it descends upon us at a date that we don't know in advance, but should be sometime this summer, I would expect. We'll want to revisit these scores and look specifically at what, how we can improve that in our response in the upcoming competition.
All right, we have 10 minutes left, unless we can go over today. Is there somebody coming in behind us today?
No. I don't think so. Can you check the calendar for this room? There's not a council briefing today. I'll be brief on the ESG update. Since you all met last, the ESG office has announced both our funding amount for the coming year and the timeline. So I had said last month I thought that the ESG application cycle would open in July. Just kidding, it's coming in June. And so that's new information, and then we'll be due in August. Also, our dollar amount is a slight decrease from last year. Last year we had, if you go down to the bottom, last year we had just over 128,000. This year we have $127,904. So almost identical, just very minimal decrease.
What was that again, Emily? How much?
127,904. We, at your meeting last month, we established that funding allocations work group, which Sarah is going to chair. We've got folks to participate in that, so we'll be getting that work group up and running so that we're prepared for that June timeline.
Okay.
Questions? Okay.
Any questions? Point in time?
All right, point in time count, 9 minutes. I'll skip the background. You all are familiar with this. Point in time count occurred January 31st. Results have been submitted to HUD by the deadline. You can see the participating agencies, as you know, emergency shelter and transitional housing programs that already enter data into HMIS. Don't do anything additional on the night of the point in time count. We're able to pull that data directly from HMIS. Other programs use paper surveys, and the unsheltered count uses paper surveys. All of those come back to our team. Staff do an enormous amount of work to get those entered into HMIS so they can be deduplicated and aggregated so that we can get to our final results. This year, we collected 355 paper surveys, 76 of which were not included in the final data. Some of those were duplicates. 35 folks reported that they were staying with friends and family, which means they don't meet that literal homelessness definition, and so we're not able to include them in the point-in-time count. And then we had 16 forms that were returned with no data, just a note that they were declined. We included that here to say what you already know to be true, which is that the point-in-time count is our most comprehensive data set and also has limitations. It's just not possible for us to connect with every unsheltered person in our community on that night. We want to do a great job of that. We want to continually improve that, but we know that there are limitations to that. Overall, the 2023 count identified 573 people who were experiencing homelessness on that night. Most of those folks were in shelters or transitional housing, 402. And then 171 people were unsheltered. What we included here is data from the last several years because we've been in a pandemic. It's been a strange time, an outlier time. So if you look at that 2020 data, I would consider that kind of our pre-pandemic baseline. That was our historic sort of business as usual data. And you can see in that our total population hasn't changed that much if you look at the 2020 total and the 2023 total. But where folks are has changed. And so the unsheltered count specifically, while it decreased from 2022, is still almost 3 times as high as our unsheltered count prior to the pandemic. And we know that there are certainly a lot of folks who are still outside. Demographic characteristics, these are relatively in line with the same demographics that we saw in the 2022 count. Majority of our total 573 people identified as white. We do have a disproportionately high number of people who identified as Black, African American, or African compared to the general population, and that you can see the light blue color there, the kind of blue-gray is general population data. Majority of people identified as male, and majority of people identified as non-Hispanic. Subpopulations, keep in mind, as you know, that people can appear in multiple categories here, so these numbers don't total to 573. People can be both chronic and veteran, can be both a youth and an adult with a mental illness. So our chronic number in particular, we identified 122 people who met that definition of 12 months homelessness plus a disability. Our veteran number is 195. That's about 34% of our overall population. That's very high compared to other COCs in the country. Nationally, veterans are about 7% of the homeless population. And the difference for us is, Tim McEllier, the difference for us is that we have a regional VA medical center, and so we have folks from across the region, certainly, but across the country who are coming for care. And then we also have a very good transitional housing program so we have a lot of folks in our veteran population who are sheltered. We don't have a lot of veterans who are unsheltered in our community because we have such strong resources for vets.
Yeah, and I want to mention too, the veterans that come into our program are eligible to stay in our program for 2 years. So although HUD doesn't recognize them being in a transitional housing program as, being housed or, whatever, unless they decide to do something else or they get housed in the permanent housing, they are not going to be homeless for 2 years. So I think that's something that's really, important to.
Do you want to keep talking a little bit while this?
No, I'll keep talking and add to that point that, one of the reasons we don't score highly on the length of time homeless is that HUD defines transitional housing as homelessness. And so people are in transitional housing, or what we were also calling program beds, for 2 years, and that slows down our performance. And it's always going to do that unless we make a major change in one of those programs, which I'm not advocating for right now. I just want to be realistic about that.
Or the definition gets changed.
Or the definition gets changed, which.
It's probably never going to happen.
Okay.
I'll also add that although we have a very large subpopulation of veterans who are homeless, we also have a lot of housing resources for veterans through the HUD-VASH program and the supportive services for veteran families programs.
I don't really feel qualified to speak to this, but is the race self-identified?
Yes.
And why is there such a 1-2 kind of approach? You're either or. Why isn't there a mixed race option?
There is. Could you scroll back up to that? All the way at the end there's a multiple races option, and so there were some folks who identified in that category.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
But that is a choice that they make, right? Whether to identify
That's right.
as a.
Sorry, can you go back up one? Household composition, again, this is not a significant change from last year's point in time count. Vast majority of people in our COC who were identified on the night of the point in time count are single adults. That was about 88%. So not a large family population identified. 66 people, which included 40 children. And then last year, as you know, what we've just gone through are the questions that are PIT requirements from the federal government. Last year in our COC, we added a couple of questions on the unsheltered survey, did that again this year. We hadn't done that in the past, so we don't have data prior to last year for these questions. But in our 2023 count, we asked when you last had housing, where was it? And you can see that dark blue bar on the top is the 2023 answer, 2022 is the other. We had, again, this is specifically for people who are unsheltered, which was 171 folks. We had 131 responses to this question. So see that the majority of people are either from Asheville or Western North Carolina, 7.6% of people from elsewhere in North Carolina, and then 21% of people from another state. And then of the people who reported that they did not last have housing in Asheville, meaning that they were homeless when they came here, we also asked what brought you to Asheville, and you can see the answers there. To me, this really speaks to some diversion opportunity, particularly since our top two, family and people getting stuck here, meaning transportation has broken down, something like that. Both of those are significant diversion opportunities for us to help reconnect people with those family members maybe, or help fix their car or provide that bus ticket if that's what they need. And then what's the main reason you aren't staying at a shelter right now? We had 109 responses to this question. And you can see those there. This is good information for the shelter work group, and also, I think, relatively in line with the same data that we saw last year. Before you go into this, next we'll talk about the housing inventory count, which we submit on the same night, but do y'all have questions about the point in time count?
Questions? Can you scroll back to the racial demographics? Yeah. Okay, so what we're seeing is that within the population of people experiencing homelessness, 26% of folks are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, or other people of color. And when I asked the question for coordinated entry, are we taking these demographics into account, what I would expect is that we are looking at the referrals and making sure that they come close to matching these percentages. And if they don't, that we're making some adjustments to make sure that we are providing resources, permanent supportive housing resources equitably to all members of the homeless population.
One thing I'll mention, and that we don't have this data here, but we do, when the Alliance looked at our data, they did identify that in our unsheltered population, was had more folks who are white compared to our overall homeless population, and that is a trend across the country, that in general that holds true for unsheltered subpopulations. So I'll mention that for future consideration.
I just had a question, kind of as a follow-up to Jamie's question. In the coordinated entry process, do individuals self-identify, or is that noted by the staff member?
In race?
Yes.
It's always self-identified, yeah. Quick public service announcement for anyone listening. Staff should never identify that for anyone. Definitely, so service provider staff know that they're asking those questions of individuals.
I have one question on the survey results. The too many rules thing, do we have any breakdown on that? Or if we don't have any breakdown on that, is that something that we can ask the coordinated entry and outreach people to get some breakdown on? Because it feels like, since it's a #1 issue for not being willing to go into shelter, we got no idea which of the rules are.
I 1,000% agree, Rick, because, if that's being said there and we go and open
Exactly.
a shelter, if that holds true, well, you're going to have, some kind of rules, some kind of policies, no matter what kind. If it's, transitional housing, shelter, operation, whatever, you have to have some rules. So what exactly does that mean? And let's get some context on that. I think that's really important.
Since we're stuck in the world we are right now, where we're moving camps, there's an opportunity to get at least some anecdotal data, you know? I mean, all the stuff that was in the press lately of the Craven Street Bridge thing. Outreach teams were out. They didn't want to move to shelter, at least that's what the press says, I don't know the truth. A why that would get at this, so we could build some data anywhere, keep it somewhere, that is going to be huge on whether our shelter effort's going to actually fill the beds.
I'll speak to the data that we have, and then Marcus, I wonder if you might address that between outreach and AHOPE. On the slide you saw there, we had 49 responses, and this wasn't like a drop-down menu or a checkbox on the survey form. We were asking for qualitative data from people so that it was really wide open, really wanted to get people's answers in their own words. And then we categorized those for purposes of some analysis. So we can go back and look at the detailed answers for the people who we put in that rules category about what that list was.
I have a question, comment. How about the surveys from folks with lived experience that NAH collected that might have some data to speak to that, some of the rules issues?
I'd say with AHOPE and outreach, generally when they speak about rules, it's about their freedom to come and go as they please, more often than not, rather than it being restricted. Then you do have individuals who aren't willing to give up their substance use to go into a facility. And a lot of times that may be a rule that's restrictive for some people. And even if they're not actively using, it's being able to go into a facility and have that paraphernalia or have that drug or be in active intoxication.
Can I get to you in just a minute? So we'll put a pin in that one for public comment here in a minute. The other thing that I've heard about some people is pets. You know, so the rules can be around sobriety and that sort of thing, but they can also be, there's no place to take my dog.
Wasn't there a separate category on that, though, for?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think there was.
Yeah,
I think I saw in looking
Okay.
at it.
So that one's specific then?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that one in itself is got two different answers to it. Can I have a pet in my room, or can I have a pet on the facility, or can my pet go to a shelter? You know, there will be different answers on whether those are acceptable to the potential housed person.
Yeah, but we are, so to be specific, our shelter RFP is asking people to give us options with the least restrictive rules possible.
All right, housing inventory count. So on the same night that we do the point-in-time count, we also look at what beds are available in our community and what type of beds they are and what the utilization rate was, so that we have a map of the housing inventory as well as the number of folks who are experiencing homelessness. Overall, we had 591 beds that were active, doesn't mean they were filled necessarily, but 591 beds that were available. 192 of those were emergency shelter. 17 of those were non-congregate shelter. That is mostly through Homeward Bound's rapid rehousing program, where when folks are enrolled in rapid rehousing, they have some resources to provide a hotel stay until that apartment can be located. And you can see in 2020, we had 0 non-congregate beds. It wasn't a model that we were aware of in our line of work. And in 2021 and 2022, we had significant non-congregate capacity related to the Red Roof Inn and the Ramada, along with some other non-congregate beds. And then Code Purple and transitional housing. The main change that I see in our inventory in 2023 compared to the past is that our, what I would call COVID response inventory has decreased appropriately, and our kind of traditional inventory has increased. Certainly some of that is through veteran dedicated beds, but our traditional shelter and transitional housing providers that had to decrease capacity during the pandemic to keep folks safe. Some of those beds have been coming back online. And so we're seeing that regular inventory return. Bed utilization, so you can see our inventory and then on the point in time count how many folks we had in those locations and then how many beds were open. I'll point out that Code Purple really skews this particular data set because we had such a great capacity in Code Purple this season. And that night was not exactly Code Purple temperatures. It wasn't all that far off, but Code Purple is called to support data collection. So we had 100 Code Purple beds available, only had 14 people in. So that 86 open beds, again, kind of skews the overall number here. And then permanent housing. So on the night of the point in time count, we had 108 people in rapid rehousing, 554 people in permanent supportive housing, which includes HUD-VASH. That's a large number of those folks. And then 98 people in other permanent housing. So 760 total. That's tremendous from where I sit. That's a real win for our COC. No one's ever done a point in time count presentation this quickly, but overall, our count is, I think, more in line with the historic population size that we've seen in our community, although our unsheltered count continues to be much higher than it was prior to the pandemic. We do have those kind of traditional beds coming back online, and I think there is room to discuss how we can improve our data collection always. We want to be continuously improving on that front. Council has asked some questions about adding a summer count or other counts in other times of the year, recognizing that our population seems to change over the course of the year, and we don't actually have that data since we only do the January count based on the federal requirement. We'll certainly want to convene a planning group for the 2024 count, no time soon, but eventually. And our goal as staff, and what I hear from you all as the board, is that we want to really emphasize HMIS participation so that we are less and less reliant on the point-in-time count as our comprehensive data set and can instead be looking at real-time data that's just more accurate and more detailed in our COC. Also, lastly, big thanks to Charles for his work on this. It's just awful. Doing the point-in-time count is just awful, and he did a really tremendous job, and I appreciate his efforts very much.
Thanks, Charles.
Okay, any questions about point in time or the housing inventory count? So I think I'm going to skip the next item, postpone that till next month, and open it for public comment. Now, please come forward. Give us your name and just for the record.
Hi, I'm Anna Pizza with Counterflow. I had a suggestion as far as gathering more data on the restrictions as far as rules. So while we continue to look at the in-depth answers to the questions and get information from AHOPE, I thought another thing that would be more easy to compile is to get some of the regulations and requirements from different shelter providers. So we would have a list of what some of the things they accept and don't accept. That would be a quick way to get kind of an understanding of what some of the restrictions are.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other public comment?
Hey, I'm Mary Singer. Thanks for being here and doing the work. I have a few things. So last night I was poring over some notes from when Emily was talking to us back after Naya did the report, and I remember writing down something that said one of the primary issues in our area is community engagement, community networking, and coordination. And seeing that kind of reflected in one of those other charts with the green on it about community engagement, I'm just thinking, like, wouldn't it be great if everyone knew each other more and could work together better to the best of their ability because they know each other more? And I'm wondering, it's raised questions with, like, So when you have a company or a brand and you have a lot of employees, or even if it's a small company, if it's a larger company, obviously you're going to have lots of departments, like the city of Asheville has lots of departments. Do those departments know that the other departments exist? Do you know who works in your own department? And this is really important when we're giving a referral to a client, or if we're leaving out a referral because we don't know that a service or a product or a department exists, because we don't know those people personally and we don't, spend time working together with them, coordinating with them, and engaging with them. This is also an advertisement for hire more community health workers. I'm employable, please hire me. And so wouldn't it be fun if we put on a conference/education/fun event for whoever, let's say you start from the inside, right? Because everything we do on the inside ripples out to affect the larger people, the clients, the people we work with. So if you start with just your company or just your department, and you have a conference, it's going to be something that's going to be educational. We know we need more training, and we can also do that in a really fun way by having entertainers and people in the community that are artists and performers come to give you a nice break on your intermission in between. So doing this, I think would be a really great way to bring people together. I mean, think about when was the last time you and your whole department or you and your whole company or brand all came together in the same space for the same common goal, and you got to know each other and what product or service that person provides, that department provides, so that you can better know, I know next time who to refer out to. I know that we have this service that exists that I didn't know about before. I'm informed, I'm educated, and I got a little training session, and I had a comedian entertain me. I mean, this is who we are, Asheville. Let's learn and love and grow and have fun at the same time. Other thoughts that I have about the restrictions and things that are the big issue for why people don't want to go to shelters. Thank you for, I have saved from shelters that I've been in for years now, handbooks with rules written in them. And I can tell you I have a lot to say about this because it's not always clear what the rules are. And that's a big deal when we're creating safety, emotional, psychological, and physical safety for our clients. So we want to make sure that we're clear. We want to emphasize communication and clear directives, obviously, if we want people to do something. So I would advise really going over those handbooks and looking at all the rules that are in there, and also addressing the rules that aren't in there that just come up from here and there throughout the day. Go do this thing, we expect you to do that thing. It's nowhere to be found in a handbook. That's obviously a little bit confusing to people that are seeking safety. So I would love to help with this. I also can't keep working for free. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Any other questions, announcements? Wrap up. All right, we're adjourned. Thanks.